Bit about what voice is. When we talk about voice, it is important, and I do want parents to give their children that sense of voice, and that, as parents, the way we really give that voice power is to listen to them. And so when I'm talking about voice, I am talking about literal voice, where we want our kids to feel like what their perception is, what their feelings are important and valid, but it's bigger than that. So when we talk about voice, what I'm really talking about is authentic self. And authentic self, I'll talk about here in a minute. But the reason why authentic self is important to look at, and to look at as soon as possible, is that authentic self has so much to do with our sense of self esteem, that sense that when we can be who we are authentically, we feel more confident. And you'll hear people talk about being comfortable in your skin. It's that sense of who I am, and I'm comfortable with who I am, kind of reality that is so important, which also leads them to be more self aware. And the more self aware someone is, the more capable they are of being able to navigate their world, knowing who they are and how they function, and finding strategies that help them successfully navigate their world. And then we know that it also is a big factor in resiliency. And so we know that, ironically, opposite of what people might think, ironically, the kids who are the most sort of self defined, have the most authentic self, are actually the most resilient, even in really challenging situations like middle school, which are considered to be extremely challenging for kids. They actually have more resiliency. So we have all these reasons why we want to work on voice or authentic self. Now, with that said, ironically, the people who undermine this authentic self, the most and the earliest, are parents. And that is obviously with no malicious intent whatsoever. In fact, if anything, the intent is because it's usually twofold, but the one intent is that we want our kids to be successful with their peers, successful in institutions. And so we grew up with our parents really believing that we had to be sort of a certain way to be liked, accepted, etc. And we really still take that on. Ironically, it's that very thing that undermines what we're talking about tonight, which I'll talk more about in a minute. So, questions about sort of why we want to look at this.
I don't have any questions so far.
Okay, so I want to start with, when we talk about voice or authentic self, what is it we're talking about? What we're talking about is anything that is our genuine self expression in any form. So I'm just going to start to list some things and sort of talk about, ways that we have to be careful not to undermine, even with good intention, to undermine the very thing that would actually help our children. One is, for example, clothing. And from a really young age, we have, because again, it was probably how we were raised, we will say things to our kids. They'll come out dressed in something and we'll say, that doesn't match. Or you should put on, and we try to have them dress a certain way, thinking that they're going to be more accepted by their peers, or more valued by their peers. The other thing that can get in the way, and this is that piece I said there were two things. One was the reason that we undermine. One is because we're trying to protect our children. The other is, you have to remember, we are the first generations of parents that literally, we're changing the belief system that your children are a reflection of you. Our parents felt strongly that everyone in society, and society sort of reinforced this, that children's behavior, children's appearance, children's choices were all a reflection of their parenting. So there was this incredible pressure that parents had that made them also undermine their kids' authentic self-esteem. Because, for example, we talk about, and I was talking about clothing, we don't want someone to think that we don't, help our kids pick out cute clothes, or that we aren't there helping them get dressed, and so we want to look like we're being good, conscious parents, and so we don't want them to look like a reflection of, someone who's gotten poor parenting or poor attention or whatever that might be. But I really want to remind people, this is hugely important to remember, your children aren't only a reflection of your parenting. Parenting is one small component of who your children are, but a bigger and really important part of who they are is really guarding that authentic self that from the time they are knee high, we start to undermine and other people start to undermine. So, clothing would be one thing. And it doesn't have to mean that you necessarily like what they're wearing. If you, for example, had a child who came out dressed and you could say, I love your style, because it's their style. They personally picked it out because they felt good about it. Somehow it was felt like a reflection of who they were. So if they had stripes and polka dots, that's what they feel good about. Or you could say something like, looks like you feel really good about your outfit today, or something like, that says, I want to support your authentic self expression. Now, another one that comes up really early is hair. And, parents will start from the time kids are toddlers trying to force them to comb their hair or wear their hair in a certain way. And particularly kids, when you start off in sort of that kindergarten, first, second grade, they'll have that little fuzzy spot in the back where they've slept and move their head around and it's just this big knot. And parents will say, well, you have to comb your hair. And I remind parents, it's like, go to school. Everybody has that thing in the back. Nobody's judging. Other kids aren't judging other kids by that knot in the back of their head. So, again, reminding yourself is that you really want your kids to be able to really authentically express what they like. If they want their hair short, if they want their hair long, sometimes we have to intervene for health and safety. So we can't let them go forever without washing it, but they don't need to wash it every other day. um, we sometimes have to intervene and say, if you want your hair long, then you have to comb it because it's getting so tangled that it's becoming health and safety. It's going to be too hard to comb out. So we'll have some parameters of still what are health and safety when we look at these things. But beyond health and safety, our job is to try to support that authentic self. So, for example, in middle school or even high school, probably is more like it, some of the kids will say, I want to actually have a piercing. And some of them will say, I want it to be on my belly button. And parents will say, you can pierce your ears, but not your belly button, because I think of that as health and safety, because it catches on your pants and can actually tear out, and that could be a health and safety issue. Or you could say, I'm not even going to pierce your ears until you're old enough that I know you can really clean your earrings, because that would be health and safety. So if something is health and safety, then I do want parents to be able to intervene. For example, in middle school, a lot of the kids want to both cut their hair in unusual ways, because there's a lot of self-exploration in middle school, or color their hair. And I'll say, well, Those are temporary things. If it's temporary, if hair is going to grow, if color washes out eventually or grows out eventually, then, those are really good ways for kids to explore their self-identity and to try on different identities because they're temporary. Now, personally, I tell my kids they can't do black dye because we know black dye has some carcinogenic concerns. So I'd say, no, it's fine. You can have green, but you're not going to have black. I can't have you do black right now. And so you're going to have the parameters of health and safety, but really remind yourself that we're talking health and safety. Okay, so the other things that would be reflections would be the the choices they make in play. What are they interested in? Are they fine motor? Are they gross motor? Are they artistic? Are they interested in music? What kind of music? The type of music they like is a part of their self-definition. Friends are part of their self-definition. And one of the things that I'll see parents do from a very young age is they try to pick friends that they think would be good influences for their kids. And I remind parents, it's like, it's not your job to pick your kids' friends. Your kids' friends are part of their authentic self. It's our job to set parameters. So let's say by middle school, they have picked a friend that you don't think has good supervision or is in an unsafe situation at home, and you'd say, you can't go over to that friend's home, and you'd explain why, but that friend is welcome to come to our house anytime. So that you're basically saying, or sometimes people will not even want them in your home because there'll be kids who will be very challenging, and I'll say it's okay to say to your kids, it's hard to have this friend over because they're hard for us to manage and it's just too much work for us. But you can be friends with them at school. Absolutely, they're your friends. So you can set parameters that are related to health and safety, but you're also going to be sure that you're very conscious that you're not undermining that part of that really authentic self-expression of picking out friends. Music, type of music, the books they like to read, their humor, their sense of humor. And then we start to get down even to further things that I see a lot of parents play with, which is trying to correct a child's walk if they have sort of an unusual gait. That unusual gait is part of their authentic self. And if there's anything we want to do, is we want to make them comfortable in that authentic self. The way they laugh, the sort of little idiosyncrasies that they may have, all of those are authentic self. Their food choices. And again, we're going to be setting parameters around health and safety, but we really want kids to be able to say, I'm not a big broccoli person. I'll eat, and you'll say, well, then you have to pick out peas or carrots. And so we're going to be sure that they stay within the parameters of health and safety, but we're also going to really allow them to have as much of that authentic self-expression as we possibly can. So when we talk about what constitute voice, it's any of those forms of self-expression. So questions about any of that at this point?
No questions yet.
Okay. All right. So in terms of the way that we can really help kids and be partners in them hanging on to that authentic self, one is just not getting in the way. That's number one, because as I said, we are the first and probably the most impactful in undermining that authentic self. And so, really being conscious of our own sort of self consciousness about our children and our own really entrenched kinds of things that happen to us that sort of naturally we want to do with our children in terms of quotes training them to be out in society. So I want people first to, what I'd say is get out of the way. Try to stay out of the way unless it's health and safety. Let them do as much self-expression, self-definition as possible. And then, we'll talk about other ways that we can reinforce that. So number one is to try to get out of the way if you can. All right. The second thing is adding what we call authority and amplification. Authority is more than just sort of giving them validation. It's one thing to say, I can tell you're really frustrated when daddy keeps tickling you and when you tell him to stop. Um, that's validation, and that's great. I want us to validate our kids' feelings or thoughts or perceptions. All of that is part of really growing that more self-awareness and more authenticity. But authorization goes a step further. So, for example, authorization would look like, you know, I also get very frustrated when daddy will tickle me and doesn't stop. So basically, what you're saying as an adult in the adult world, your perception is validated by my even longer perception or more wise or more life experience perception of the same experience. That's authorization. So anytime that you can authorize what your children are experiencing is going to be a way of actually partnering with them to have a stronger, clear, more confident, authentic self. Now, amplification is another thing that we can do, and that is where our children will express something, and because they are probably children, and this can be young children or high school children, but because they are younger, because they probably have less life experience, they are not being either validated or heard by other people. So, for example, from a really young age, I will teach parents with even toddlers to not necessarily take away a toddler's power by telling another child, listen, my child just told you not to hit them. That takes away their power. Instead, I'll teach a parent to say, Joe, I just heard Emily tell you to stop. You're going to amplify Emily's voice that she already used. So from a very young age, I ideally want adults around children amplifying them when they aren't being heard. Or another example is I will see kids in grade school whose grandparents, for example, will try to force them to have to give them a hug or a kiss goodbye. And when we're working on body sovereignty, which is another really part of authentic self, when we're looking at body sovereignty and someone will try to force them to give them a hug or shame them into giving a hug, would be another time to amplify their voice, where you could say to your parent, Dad, Emily's telling you she doesn't feel like giving you a kiss right now. In other words, you're amplifying she has the right to have the body sovereignty that she is feeling like she needs at that moment. So when we talk about authorizing, we're actually adding our own experience to their experience as a way of authorizing their perception or feeling. Amplification is literally us just amplifying the voice they've actually used and being sure the people around them are hearing their voice. Okay, so questions about authorization and or amplification.
No questions yet.
Okay, so just out of curiosity, Becky, we're gonna try this and see how it works. So I kind of want to give people a chance to play with this a little bit. So think of one time or one situation that you think you could amplify your child, and think of one situation where you think you could authorize your child, no matter what age your child is right now. So think of something and then put it into the chat for Becky to share.
Okay, I'm not getting anything.
Give them a couple minutes because it may
Okay.
take time to think of something that they could amplify or authorize.
Okay. I still don't see anything coming
Okay.
through. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Okay.
Okay.
Can you remind us of the difference again?
Yes. So the difference is authorizing is where you've also had that same experience and you add it to their experience. So let's say that your child says to you, I hate it when people play with my hair. They just come over and start playing with my hair. And you say, I know, I like people will do that with my hair too. It's, with my curly hair too. It really bugs me too. So they're basically authorizing that child's experience.
Okay.
Amplification is literally just amplifying their voice. So amplification would be literally saying, I heard them tell you, or I heard them say.
Okay. So one example we have for authorize is I loved the confidence I felt when I cut my hair short too.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Exactly. That would be great.
Yeah, and then we have a couple that look like they just got cut short. I think they hit enter and it just came up authorize and authorizing. So maybe we can wait a couple seconds to see. Oh, here's one. I acknowledge how you felt when your brother would not respect leaving your room when you asked him to leave. Have you noticed he did the same thing with me and it bothered me as well?
Yes, that would be another authorization. An amplification in that situation would look like going to her brother and say, I just heard your sister tell you to leave your room. This,
Okay.
that would be an amplification where they wouldn't say, you need to get out of your sister's room. That would be taking away the voice of the sister. But if you went in and said, I heard your sister tell you to get out of her room, that's amplifying her.
Okay. I think that's all we have right now.
Okay.
Those are
But
great.
yeah, that definitely you've got the idea. All right.
Oh,
So,
here's one more.
okay.
Oh, I have a couple. Sorry, they're popping up right now.
Okay,
So
good.
for authorize, I understand you get shy with talking with others. I was the same way when I was your age.
Yes, that's good. That's good.
Okay.
And that will lead me to another tool we're going to be using in a minute. So yes, okay,
Okay. And
and
then
that's authorization.
and then one for amplification. M is saying she's not worried about how long it will take her hair to grow back. When J said, "Why would you cut your hair?"
Exactly.
Okay.
Excellent. That was excellent to catch that. Yes, that's amplification. hmm Yeah,
Okay.
it's powerful. I mean, when you hear it, when you hear you even read it out loud, Becky, the examples they gave, can you imagine from a child's perspective, how powerful that would feel to
Mm-hmm.
have someone do that,
Yes.
how much confidence it would give you.
Yeah. And that actually happened to this attendee. So,
Excellent.
mhm.
Okay, good.
Okay.
That's great. All right, so let's talk about some other ways that you can support your kids and keeping that authentic self. Now, I want to remind you, it's interesting because what I'll notice is that parents do a pretty good job about managing their own self-consciousness, as well as really trying to support their children's authentic self when they're little, when they're toddlers, maybe even early grade school. But as kids start to get older, later grade school, even middle grade school, certainly by high school and or middle school and high school, that the parents' fear really starts to come in. And I think all that entrenched stuff from when we grew up, where our parents were really very what we call externally focused, where they were, what will people think is sort of the focus of that. What will people think if you cut your hair? What will people think if you wear that? What will people think if you laugh that loud? What will people think if you don't walk in a different way? It's like we were taught to be incredibly what we call externally contexted. And that external context really undermined our self awareness, our self esteem, our authenticity. And of course, then it was a result of that, because all of those are things that make us confident and competent to really navigate. It made us less resilient and less competent as even adults. For a lot of people are still struggling with a lot of that because of that belief system. And again, no, I don't believe any malicious intent on even our parents. It was just how they were raised and what they thought would make a difference or keep you safer. But with that said, as your kids get older, it's going to be harder to really fight that old entrenched thinking. So I want to remind people how important it is for you to sort of keep your notes handy and just sort of take a peek at them, to remind you that you really want to partner with your kids for their sake, that it's a positive for you to partner with them to really try to help them establish and hang on to that authentic self-esteem. So here's some other ways to do that. One is you're going to work really hard to support their voices and strategies. And this can look like several different ways. Remember, I said I would come back after that last one where they said something. I'm trying to remember what the one where they were authorizing it. Um, oh, talking about the shyness, for example. I also, saying I also, when I was your age, struggled with talking to people. And so you're authorizing that their experience is normal and valid. And you might really empower them by like saying something along the lines of, what are some ways that you deal with that? Or how do you make yourself feel more comfortable in those situations? So you're basically saying to them, what strategies do you have? Not having them always look to us, but what strategies do you have to make this better for yourself or to feel more comfortable? So that's one way that we can support their voices and encourage strategies. We can also just really support who they are by being interested. One of the things we've talked about, I think, in the past, some of the past workshops in terms of self-esteem, is I'll say one of the most important things for your child's self-esteem that a parent can do is to be interested in what they're interested in, not necessarily try to direct what they're going to be interested in because we think it would be, good for them or it's what we like, but to be interested in what they're interested in. And so you don't even have to necessarily like sports, but if you have a child who loves competition and loves team sports, you're going to be sure that they both can participate in them and that you're going to go as often as you can, not because you necessarily love it yourself or even that you have to say you like it yourself. I don't think you need to say you don't dislike it, but they can know that it's not your interest. What affects their self-esteem is that you are interested in what they're interested in. You support what they authentically are drawn to or what their passions are. So if you have a child who is very into animal rights and she or he is in middle school, then might say, I'll go on that march with you. I would love to go on that march with you, meaning that you are going to support what their passions, their authentic self-interests are, and strategies to really express those self-interests. So questions about that piece about supporting their voice and strategies.
I don't have any questions yet.
Okay. And you can interrupt me anytime too,
Okay.
Becky.
Okay.
All right. So the second one I want is for people to reinterpret the messages that they receive from, it could be social media, it could be media in general, it could be from grandparents, it could be sort of broader societal messages, that you're going to reinterpret some of those messages that they are getting. That could be about anything. It could be from anything about what, you know, attractiveness is, what good hair or, skin color is attractive. You could reinterpret that in terms of the messages they're getting. You could reinterpret what messages they're getting about gender and what people can do or can't do as a result of gender. You can reinterpret the messages they may get about what's considered to be good music or what.
Candace,
Yes.
I have a question that kind of
Yeah,
ties
yeah.
in with the music thing. My son is 15. He started listening to country music 2 years ago, and he identifies with the genre to the point of picking up an accent and the poor grammar. How would you manage this?
So one of the first things that I would do is I would join them. And that's part of what we're talking about. When people are exploring authentic self, it's like the first thing we have to do is actually join them in that authentic self in order for them to feel safe enough that we can give information, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, or even see things through their eyes, or even see what they know. So for example, I totally relate to this because one of my sons was very into, um, I just went blank, into heavy metal. And it was like really not a form of music that I was that interested in. And it has some pretty intense kinds of lyrics. But I made an effort to go in and just sit on his bed or lay on his bed while he was in there listening to that heavy metal, and I would look for things that I could join him with. Like, I love the beat of that, and I could genuinely find something like that is a fascinating beat, or something that made it look like I was acknowledging that there was a reason for him to like it. And then from there, what I found was that at that point, he was willing to do things like he'd say to me, I know you're not going to like these lyrics, Mom, but I want you to hear blah, blah, blah. And I'd be like, okay, that told me that he does have the value systems we talked about, that he knows that there are lyrics that I wouldn't necessarily think were appropriate or valued. But I wouldn't have known that if I just said, turn that crap off. That crap, that's music is crap, and I don't want you listening to it. By him, by me joining him, he was willing to give me information that said he was assessing some of that. It also allowed me at times to be able to say, you know, that is hard. This song is hard for me because that lyric is so personally painful for me. And so I could still express myself. If I hadn't joined him, I couldn't have done that. So that joining part is really important. Okay. Anything else around that? I hope that answered for whoever that was.
Yeah, I think that was perfect. And I don't have anything. Oh, here I do have another question. I used to protect my kids' spirits after they were cut down and ridiculed by their dad. But my counselor said to let your kids develop their own beliefs about their dad instead of protecting them from him. What are your thoughts?
I think this would be a perfect example of reinterpreting the messages. So, for example, one, I can give you an example of where I would have done that. So I think it's incredibly important not to try to define their interpretations. And it's hard when, you know, especially with exes, where we all have our own issues, and some of our own triggers that are similar, um, where you could be very critical, but to remember that your kids are, from their perspective, half of each parent. So if they feel like one parent is being disdained, that means that half of them is not very worthy or good. If the other parent is disdaining you, for example, that means that the other half of them isn't good. So when parents are sort of interpreting um, things in a way that comes from their own experiences and may not be their child's, that's dangerous. In terms of the protecting, it's a little of both. It's like there is a certain level of protecting I still would anticipate would be appropriate so that children don't internalize some of the messaging that they are getting that could be toxic from another parent. I don't want them to internalize it. On the other hand, I do want them to be able to form their own impressions. And sometimes when we step in, quotes, to protect them, what happens is they end up being in a position to have to defend that parent, which doesn't allow them to self assess. If they are defending, they can't self assess. So it's a fine line. So I always, what I say to clients is, I want you to always be respectful, ever compassionate about reinterpreting messages, so that it could look like, an example I was going to give is one of my children were talking about how what a lack of sort of generosity or financial support or help they were getting from their parent, their other parent. And I said, and they were sort of interpreting that as not caring. And I didn't want them internalized that that parent, their other parent, didn't care about them. So I reinterpreted that information as, because of the situation your father grew up in, he is incredibly fearful about not having money. And that fearfulness is manifest in whatever that was in that way. It's not about his lack of caring, it's about his fear. And so sometimes we can protect our children, not by completely protecting them from someone, but by reinterpreting the messages. Um, you'll sometimes be in a social setting with a big family, for example, where an uncle might say something that is very sexist or very unkind. And you can later, probably in a more safe context, go back and say, I don't necessarily agree with, you don't even say necessarily, I don't agree with how Uncle George said blah, blah, blah. In other words, that isn't necessarily everyone's truth. That's Uncle George. So this is part of that reinterpreting the messages they receive. But it's really important that we are being very conscious that we aren't imposing our own agenda on our children when we do that. Okay. Anyone else?
Nope, not so far.
All right. So the next one related to this is giving information. So, for example, um, I did not tell my children what they could or couldn't wear, or how they could cut their hair, or as they got older, how they colored their hair. But I would give information to them. So, for example, I would say, Christopher, there will be people who will judge if you color your hair that way. Or, Chris, you could find that when you go to apply for a job, um, dressing with those pants could affect your getting a job. I would not say to him, you can't wear those pants. I wouldn't say you couldn't dye your hair, you know, green on one side. I would say, this is what you're going to run into. And there, you may find people who will say these things. Um, Now, again, the line is health and safety. So if it's health and safety, you still want to give information, and you want to give information that protects authentic self, not undermines authentic self. So, for example, there would be times when my daughters would be dressed to go with a friend in high school up to Seattle. And I knew that I wasn't there to be able to supervise or protect them. And I might say at that point, Lissy, I really want you to switch your top out, because there are still a lot of people who have very poor boundaries. And I can't protect you. And so that to me would be health and safety. I would never say, you're asking for trouble if you wear something like that, or you're dressing too scantily, or have a parent who'll say, you're dressing like a whore, you can't go because you're dressing like a prostitute, or something. And I don't want kids to, they feel good about sometimes their bodies, about something they think is stylish and cute, and sometimes it's not safe depending on the context. So I would reinterpret why I was setting a boundary, and be sure that they were clear. The information that I was giving them is that they should be able to go nude to Seattle if they want, and not be, have to worry about being hurt or offended. And there's still many, many people in the world with very poor boundaries. So it's giving information is incredibly powerful way of joining your kids. Okay. Anyone about that?
Nope, I don't have any questions.
Okay. The next is just building confidence, really giving feedback when you see authentic expression. I love, I love your style. Um, it's like, I wish I was as creative. Wish I could be as creative with my hair as you are. I adore your communication, your natural communication with animals. It's like when you see those authentic self-expressions, you just want to be sure that you acknowledge that those are really worthy of being reinforced and admired. Okay, so that's building confidence. And then the last one is taking action. Now, taking action can come in a couple of different ways. Taking action can come by literally joining them. When I said, you can join them on a march of something that's really important to them, or you could go to school and advocate with them, not for them. Is everybody clear? With them, because this is always about really reinforcing that authenticity and self. So going with them to talk about an alternative assignment because there was something that was particularly harmful or painful for them
Hey,
in what they were.
Candice,
Yes,
I have a question about some clothes issues. Can I
yes,
ask you those? Okay.
absolutely.
What about making sure my daughter wears leggings or panty covers when she wears a dress? And also, my son who only wants to wear long underwear, and I'm not okay without him having at least shorts over it.
Okay, so I know clothing is hard. I just want to say, I mean, I'm laughing only because it just brings up so many memories. But I I just really I really want people to step back and really think about health and safety. Is it really health and safety? If you can really, for yourself, rationalize, and this is different for everyone. What might be health and safety for me could be something entirely different for someone else. So we have to do this work ourselves. But I think it's really to say, like, okay, why do I feel like he can't just wear the long underwear? What is there? And if you can say to yourself, there is a health thing here, and I'm not, if you can justify what that health thing is, then you say, this for me is health and safety. But I think what's really important about this is that if kids can hear us set limits on authentic expression, when it's not taking away all of it, when we 80% of the time are not only allowing that self expression, but really joining them or partnering them to protect that authentic self, then when we say something is health and safety, there shouldn't be, and usually is not, a lot of resistance because they recognize that you already are championing them. I think when they feel like it's one thing after another, and we're saying, you need to, but they really don't see it as health and safety, then, or even if they don't, but most of the time you don't say it's health and safety, then if you say it's health and safety, there's a bit of honoring you without resistance that they're going to do. So I think the real piece here is to be sure your kids are buying into that you are partnering with them to really, really hang on to this authentic self. Now, this just makes me think, I just want to remind people that one of the things that we're going to see, and particularly all the way through, but middle school's very heavy in this, early high school's very heavy in this, where people do a lot of trying on identities with clothing, with hair, with music. I mean, we'll see them try on these identities, and it scares us because they are very different from some of our value systems, some of the things we care about in love. Um, and and so we start getting fearful and getting more controlling. And I want to remind people that statistically, by the time your kids are 25 years old, 95% of them are going to be pretty much just like you in terms of your value system, etc. That's scarier to me than the fact that they're going to try on some of these things to just see how they fit for them. So I want to remind people, don't let kids exploring self-awareness, self-definition, authenticity, that exploration is what helps us become more defined in who we are. So don't let your fear sabotage you. But if it's health and safety, then, you will set boundaries. So, I can't tell you about the long underwear one, how what you would need to say around that in terms of health and safety for you, because that, you have something probably that I couldn't even probably say. What was the other thing? The one was the underwear. What was the other one the other example?
Well, she clarified a little bit about the panty covers are a big deal to her because of how she sits, and she doesn't want her flashing, or do not want to go creepy about it. Yet she had a parent point out that they were flashed.
Okay. So there's where, okay, so two things there. This is where you would give information. I do remember the underwear now with the leggings or the whatever. So here's what is really hard about this is that, again, I really want this externalized, not internalized. It's like there's nothing wrong with somebody's underpants showing. I mean, that's not horrible. There's nothing shameful about that. Um, you can talk about it makes some people uncomfortable. It's out here. It's don't have them internalize it. It's like some people are uncomfortable with seeing other people's underwear. And so in public settings, out of respect to other people, blah, blah, blah. Or if somebody was saying, well, your daughter flashed me, I just thought I should tell you, your daughter flashed me. It's like, I would be really clear. It's like, you know what? This goes back to there are people with some unhealthy sort of perspectives and responses to things that I don't agree with, but you need to be aware that people like that are out there. And so, for that reason, when I'm not around to protect you or whatever, this is what, I would like you to be able to do. But to be clear, there's nothing, this isn't about them. And, it's really sad when you think about it that, um, especially when you think in the past that it wasn't even a choice for girls to wear pants. They had to wear dresses clear up into the 70s. You couldn't even go to school with pants on. And that then they not only had to go to school with dresses, but were criticized for then, like you said, not being modest or whatever. So I think it's really good for us to step back and look like, where is our messaging and what was our messaging and how much shaming have we gotten, and what is health and safety and what is other people's stuff and what is our stuff, and then be able to authentically speak with our children about them, about that. Okay, anyone else?
Nope, that was it.
Okay, so now I'm just trying to see how we're doing on time. Okay, so now we're going to shift and talk a little bit about some of the tools that I think are important for parents to work on. So there's authentic self, and so did you get another one? I just saw you looked like something popped.
Well, it says internalizing others' feelings sounds like empathy, question mark.
Okay, so internalizing other people's feelings is not the same as empathy. So empathy, number one, is not internalizing somebody else's emotion. Empathy is Okay, let me describe empathy because this is really good. I'm really glad somebody said this because this is so important. Empathy is a really emotionally intelligent behavior. Empathy is when you've had an experience, an emotional experience, and then you recognize because the person gave a signal you recognize, which is another skill of them experiencing that same emotional experience. And then you bring it back into yourself and remember what it felt like when you had that experience, and that you know it's not your experience in this moment, it's their experience, and responding appropriately. That would be empathy. When I talk about not internalizing other people's stuff, is that sometimes, for example, I'm trying to think of a good example that comes up pretty regularly. Oftentimes, for example, grandmas and grandpas will say things like, I'm going to use just a really obvious one from a younger age, where grandmas and grandpas will say things like, don't touch yourself, that's dirty. And um, and that's because, of course, that was the message they got, that to touch yourself intimately was shameful. It was dirty, and they don't want you to be shamed. They were shamed, obviously, at some point. So, you would just say, it makes some people really uncomfortable. This is when they're teeny tiny, because once they're 4, we say there are people who are that it's a private thing and that's something you do in private because it's uncomfortable to have somebody else doing that. But when they're little, you'd say grandma and grandpa grew up where it wasn't okay to be nude or to touch yourself. So when we go to grandma and grandpa's house, you'll wear your swimsuit or your underpants because they're more comfortable. That would be respectful of grandma and grandpa's feelings, but you don't necessarily share that experience, that emotional experience that they do. You don't feel shame. So, but you have respect for what they're feeling. So empathy is like if you felt really rejected and you saw a friend get rejected at some point, and you saw a friend get rejected, you would feel really sad because you know how rejection feels, and you would go over and comfort that friend because you know how painful rejection is. That's empathy. So I don't want kids to internalize other people's emotions. I want them to have empathy. Two different things. Okay. Anyone else?
Nope, that was perfect.
Okay. So in terms of, so there's authentic self, and that's really important. And we know that's what gives kids a lot of self-confidence, a lot of resiliency, allows them to be less sort of impacted by peer pressure. So we want kids to have that. That's sort of one end of the spectrum that we know is really important in terms of their own self worth as well as peer relations. But then there are the other end, which are the learned tools of relationship that are also really important for us as parents to help our children develop so that they have an easier time navigating. And I think when people start working on these tools, it makes it easier for them to be advocates of their children's authentic selves because they recognize the difference between these really useful tools of relationship versus having to be something or somebody you aren't. So the tools we're going to look at tonight are, number one, character. So character are the learned values of personal behavior that we grow up with or learn. And I should say learn because sometimes it's not what we grow up with, because we can learn about character by social media. We can learn about character through books. We can learn about character through media. We can learn about character by watching our parents. We can learn about character by watching other people. So we learn about character, these learned personal behaviors and values. Now, what's interesting is a generation or two ago, this was really huge to talk about character. Character traits were something that people talked about a lot, pointed out to their children a lot, encouraged in their children. And as we have gotten busier and as we have sort of gotten sort of less time to really engage with our kids, this arena has really dropped off to the point of where sometimes when I'll go to a middle school, for example, and say to middle schoolers, what are some of the positive character traits you look for in your friends? They don't have a clue what I'm even talking about. They've never even heard about character traits. And so I have to even introduce the concept of positive character traits. So, positive character traits would be things like honesty, loyalty, generosity, um, respect, integrity. I'm trying to think of some of the other main ones. Um, Defending the underdog, courage, being courageous, I'm trying to think of some of the other really common ones. Nothing's coming to mind right now. Those are character traits. Those are the
Someone
things.
said reliable.
Reliable, good one. I mean, we could sit and make a list of character traits and probably should. Um, but yes, those are those learned tools of relationships that we know when people learn and manifest those, integrate and manifest those tools, they navigate relationships in a much healthier way. Accountability would be another one. Um, so, so the important piece here is number one, starting to make our children again more aware of these traits and the value of these traits and where they're learning these traits. So to point them out and to point out when you see someone do something courageous, when you see someone do something that is defending someone who is weaker, when you see someone who is generous, or if your kids are doing any of those things, that you point out that you were impressed by their generosity or impressed by their um, honesty or loyalty or whatever it was that you saw manifested, that you make it clear that those are things that you value in them. Now, the other thing is that it goes the opposite way because sometimes because we have been so busy and because our kids are exposed to so much information that doesn't come from us, that they are learning character traits that you may not necessarily want or want to encourage. So you would want to be sure that you are also conscious of what are they exposed to that are character traits I don't particularly want them to have. If that would be dishonesty, or if that is, um, I'm trying to think of one that a lot of people would complain about, being selfish. And this is a really important one though, because I'm going to come back to this one for a second. So selfish is meaning quotes never generous. And then I worry about people who undermine selfish by sort of giving this idea that being selfish is always bad. There's a balance there. So some of these characteristics you're going to have to really work with them on. Like there are times when generosity or sharing enhances relationship. And there are times when being more selfish which would be, could be called be self-absorbed, or some of the negative terms we use, where it's important, where we would put ourselves first because it's the healthy thing to do, or it's our authentic self, or. So some of this is really fine tuning as we start to talk about it. But I'd like to see parents and teachers again start to become more intentionally engaged in really helping their children develop what will eventually be their adult character traits. Okay, so questions about character.
No questions yet.
Okay. Temperament now is our hardwiring. So temperament is more closely related to voice, to authentic self. So temperament is who we are in our hardwiring. Voice is how we would manifest who we are in our hardwiring. So when we try to change someone's temperament, their hardwiring, we are going to undermine their self-esteem. You can't change temperament. It is hardwired. So when you try to change it, it only makes them feel worse about who they are and what they are. So you don't want to confuse temperament. So temperamental characteristics are things like regularity. They are things like being more in sort of what am I trying to say? Interpersonal versus intrapersonal, where you're, more, some people would say shy, but some people are more solitudinal, some people are more social. That is just hardwired into them and anywhere on a continuum. And most of the characteristics of temperament are on a continuum. There's very few people that have all their characteristics on one end or the other of a continuum. They would be things like so I so we talk about regular activity level. There are people on one end of the spectrum which would be sedentary, where they are more comfortable doing things like knitting or reading or sitting, and they're not lazy, they're more sedentary. And then there are active people who really have to move all the time, and they're on this other end of the spectrum, or anywhere in between. There are people who are more or less distractible. One end of the continuum is very distractible. The other end of the continuum, it would be people who would do what we call locking in, where they lock in on something and have trouble transitioning or unlocking. These are all temperamental characteristics. They are born that way. They will die that way. They aren't changeable. What is changeable is having kids recognize and become aware of what their temperamental characteristics are, and then helping them with strategies that make their characteristics more of an entitlement than it would be a cost. Every temperamental characteristic has a cost. Every temperamental characteristic has an entitlement. And our job as human beings is to be self-aware enough of these characteristics that we have developed strategies to minimize the cost to ourselves and others, and to maximize the entitlement of our temperaments to ourselves and others. So this is just becoming aware of that really strong um, hardwiring that we have, and then helping our children learn how to strategize around it. Okay, so questions about temperament versus character.
I don't have anything yet.
Okay, all right. Then, of course, voice is our way of presenting our temperament and character. So this is how that combination, when we manifest it, is voice. That is our expression of character and temperament. Now, the next one I want to talk about is respect. And so one of the things we want to teach our children is to be ever, ever respectful. And we want them to see it as a character trait that is manifested um, as an integrity character trait. So, in other words, if you're a person of integrity, you treat people respectfully. Let me say that again. We want our children to know and we want to model that respect is a behavior of integrity. Respect isn't a feeling. You might disagree with someone, you can completely disagree, but you can be respectful in your disagreement. You might admire someone, it doesn't mean you necessarily, quotes, like them more, but or respect them more. You can dislike someone and be respectful to them. So it's a behavior of integrity. And this is the piece we want to be sure our kids understand, that nobody has to earn their respect. If they have integrity, they will treat people respectfully. Now, with that said, there are 4 components of respect, and I'm just going to list them off here for you really quickly, and they're on your sheet as well. And then I want to talk about the next thing, which is boundaries, because sometimes people will be confused, like, how do I be respectful and still have boundaries? And I want to talk about that because it isn't one or the other. You will be ever respectful and you can have good boundaries. So the 4 components of respect are trust in the trust in the ability of another, interest in the point of view of another other than your own. It's easy for us to be respectful when we agree with someone. So respectful of the view of another other than our own. So interested, willing to own our part of a problem without criticism or blame, and recognizing and accepting others have feelings different than our own, even sharing the same experience. Okay, so questions about that. Those are respectful behaviors.
I don't have any questions about that.
Okay. And so you have that handout, right, Becky?
Yeah, if you registered before 4:30, you got the handout, but then I just put in the chat that they're more than welcome to email me tonight or tomorrow morning, and then I'll send that along.
Great.
Okay.
Great. Okay. Now, with that said, a really big piece that goes with this that our children don't learn how to do until they are much older, and sometimes too, it's not, there's never too old, because a lot of adults don't know how to set boundaries or recognize boundaries. But I want people to be sure that they do start to work on boundaries. So you will be ever respectful, but it doesn't mean that you can't have boundaries. So let's say, for example, that you are talking to someone on the phone and they are berating you and being really rude and unkind. You don't have to sit and listen to them berate you. That isn't being respectful. You can end the conversation, but you do it respectfully. You don't just slam the phone down. That's your lack of integrity if you just slam the phone down. Instead, you would say something along the lines of, I don't think this is a useful conversation. I'm going to hang up now. And you would hang up. So having respect doesn't mean you don't have boundaries. It just means you have to set your boundaries in respectful ways. So it's really important that we all recognize boundaries and that we all set boundaries. So boundaries are the rules that you want about how you want to be touched or treated. And boundaries are the rules that other people have about how they want to be touched or treated. So we want to look at boundaries with our children from two perspectives. We want them to be really clear that we're going to honor other people's boundaries. So that's when you might, for example, amplify your kids, because you are going to be able to say, if they say, I don't want you to tickle me, you're going to say, George, they're telling you to stop tickling them. You're going to amplify their boundary because you want them clear that they have the right to have a boundary about their body sovereignty. So you're going to be sure that it's said in a respectful way. Now, a respectful way with a boundary sometimes isn't nice, and this gets really confusing, particularly for females and females who are taught how to set boundaries, or not taught how to set boundaries. Whoops, cat turned it. Sorry, you guys. Um, are taught not taught how to set boundaries, and so people will, they'll say, say, please don't touch me, or please don't kick me. And you'll hear kids say, they didn't say please, so I don't have to stop kicking them. And I want people really clear, you do not have to be nice to have a boundary when you're being violated. You have to be respectful, so you'd have to do, oops, sorry, kitty. You have to be respectful. So you would have to be sure that you, for example, didn't say, hey, asshole, stop touching me. But you could be clear, don't touch me. You don't have to say, please don't touch me. It's like you can be very clear that this is a boundary. So don't confuse being nice with being respectful. Respectful is always a behavior of integrity. Nice is something you can be, and sometimes it's not appropriate to be nice when you're talking about boundaries. Now, when you set a boundary, what you want your kids to know is that they should ideally have four ways they look at things. Sometimes, a quarter of the time, ideally, they just accommodate something somebody asks or wants from them or does. And that's because in that moment, the relationship is more important than the issue. A quarter of the time, they might collaborate with someone. They might negotiate with them. They might give them a choice. Um, so they're going to do some kind of collaborative approach. And that would be when the relationship is equally important to the issue. That's when they would collaborate. So, for example, I would set a boundary around nutrition with my children, and I would expect them to have vegetables with a meal, but I might negotiate with about how many bites they had to take. Or I might say, if you don't want broccoli, grab yourself some carrot sticks. So I might negotiate with them because the issue is equally important to the relationship in that moment. A quarter of the time, if it's health and safety, you don't do any collaboration or accommodation. This would be when you say to your kids, you can't talk on your phone and drive. This is health and safety. There is no negotiating about if you talk on your phone and drive. That's health and safety. You don't negotiate if your kids are in car seats or seat belts. You don't negotiate helmets, that kind of thing. Just like you will be clear if it's health and safety, the boundary is very clear. And then there's a quarter of the time you're going to teach your kids, and do this through model as well, that the relationship isn't important and neither is the issue. And when the relationship isn't important and neither is the issue, you're just going to avoid something. This is when we see the cap is off the toothpaste after our kids have brushed their teeth. They're already in bed. In that moment, we don't care about the toothpaste that much, and we certainly don't want to have uh, getting them back up and have to worry about the relationship. So we'll either just stick the toothpaste cap back on or leave it. So you want your kids to know that there are four ways of dealing with boundaries. They can accommodate, they can collaborate, which is the choice, negotiating, compromising. There is having complete control because it's health and safety, theirs or someone else's, and there's avoid. And that ideally it should be quarter, 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 quarter. Okay, so questions about boundaries.
No questions yet.
Okay, now the piece that I want people to start to help their kids deal with is if they are feeling resentful or sometimes manipulated, if they are feeling resentful or manipulated, that is their signal, their inner signal. They need to change their boundary. So if they've been accommodating something, but they're feeling resentful, it means they may need to move to collaborate or even to health and safety where they have complete control. So that is their first signal that we don't have a good boundary, is when we feel resentful. Now, if we miss that first signal, and a lot of us miss it because we haven't been taught to recognize it or to sort of listen to ourselves about it. And if we miss that first signal, then we criticize people. And so when we criticize people, that means we missed our first signal. And that second signal of criticizing means we need to change our boundary or we wouldn't be critical of them. So it's interesting. Just before I got on, I was talking to a client who was asking me about her 9-year-old daughter and some friends. And they had played a joke. One of the friends had played what they called a joke on a friend, her daughter in this case. And it really hurt her daughter's feelings when she found out they sort of played this joke on her. And so um, the mom got the child on to Zoom and she let her express, it hurt her feelings, and that then she got to tell her friend that she didn't want her to do it again because it hurt her feelings. So she respectfully set a boundary for that person. Is everybody clear about that? That was a boundary set, because had she just, or had the mother just said, oh, it's no big deal, just let it go, or had she not even said anything to her mom and just acted like nothing happened, over time, that friend would not have had a clear boundary. That friend would have continued to cross her boundary unknowingly, and she would have gotten more and more resentful and probably started criticizing her to, other people. And I want kids to understand when they're feeling resentful and critical, it's about their boundary. It's about learning how to reset a boundary, not about what somebody else needs to do differently, because that's powerless. We can't control other people. We can set our boundaries. So, helping your children learn to recognize boundaries, to help them learn how to set boundaries respectfully, is an incredibly important relationship tool that will serve them well all the way into adulthood. So, questions about boundaries?
No questions.
Okay. You want me to give do people need any time? Just look anybody's writing or.
I can't tell if anyone's writing, but we can give them a little bit to see.
Okay. It's a big topic. Boundaries are really hard. We could spend a couple hours just talking about boundaries, honestly, but I just wanted to sort of give you a sense of sort of all these little components that really are important for us to work on in terms of helping our kids with peer relations that we just don't think about. And so there we sort of send them in to these laboratories without a lot of tools. And they learn a lot in their laboratories, but it certainly could make their lives easier if they had some tools while they were in those laboratories. All right, I'm going to go ahead, but you can interrupt me anytime, Becky, around this.
Okay.
Okay, so the next one I want to introduce is privacy. Now, this is an interesting one and has become incredibly challenging, especially as we've gotten into social media. There are two kinds of privacy, and everyone has the right to privacy. So there is external privacy, which are things like when kids start to tell you they don't want you to come into the bathroom when they're going to the bathroom. Or as your kids get older, they say, you can't come into my room without asking permission. That's external privacy. So they all have the right to external privacy. Now, the exception, of course, would be health and safety. So, for example, if someone knew that their child was stashing their marijuana or some other drugs in their room, they would be clear. It's like, I'm not going to honor health and safety or I'm not going to honor your privacy if it impedes, health and safety. So again, you still always have that power of that, but it's different than going through and searching in their room without any reason to search in their room because they have the right to privacy. That is external privacy. And I want your kids to know you have the right and other people have the right to external privacy so that as they start to get older than toddlers, you would teach them they need to knock on your door before they enter your bedroom or knock on your door and even ask if they can enter because you have the right to privacy or the right to be in the bathroom by yourself or take a bath or whatever it might be. So I think it's really important for kids to really get the concept of external privacy. Then the next one is, and that would include external privacy, would also include phone calls. So those of you who have tonight who have middle-aged kids, that sort of 8, 9 age, 8-year-olds particularly, are very, very nosy. And they'll be like, who are you talking to? You know, who isn't doing blah, blah, blah. They'll be listening on your phone calls or your conversations. And this would be a good time for you to say, this is a private conversation. And we're choosing not to share this with you. That would be external privacy. So we're going to help our kids learn how to navigate external privacy. Now, the more challenging one that we're having now is what would be considered internal privacy. So everybody has the right to have private thoughts, to have private feelings. Nobody has to share their internal privacy. And this is why for parents, when I work on communication, I'm saying what's really important is for you to be safe when your kids talk to you because you want them, you ideally would like them to share some of that internal privacy. But if they don't feel safe, they won't. And they certainly don't have to. So I'm always really clear with parents. It's like you don't get to say to your kids, you have to tell me what you're thinking, or you have to tell me what you're feeling. It's like nobody has the right to take away anyone's internal privacy, including a parent with a child. So I want your kids to know that they can't insist that a friend tell them what they're thinking, or share every thought they have, or share everything that's been told. It's like they have the right to internal privacy. Now, what's challenging in this generation is we have technology, which is very, very confusing for many of us, but particularly for children, in the sense that they think they are privately texting something, and they will say, I have the right to privacy. You don't get to look at my texts, or you don't get to see, check my phone, because they feel like it's internal privacy. And what I want kids to know is that technology, the internet, is not private. It is absolutely not private. Anyone with any particular skill can get in. Even if you erase something like a text, they can go back and retrieve it. It is not private. And that even if they erased it, someone else who they may have given information to, or a picture to, or can carry that on and give it to someone else. That is not internal privacy. A diary would be. And I am very clear with parents that they don't have the right to read their children's diaries. Their diaries are how you respect internal privacy. But I want your children to know that internet is not a place for internal privacy. Okay, so questions about privacy.
No questions.
Okay, so those are basically the learn tools for starting to manage relationships. So the two things we looked at tonight were how to really sort of shore your kids up so they have a lot of self-confidence, a lot of self-awareness, a lot of self-definition, so they aren't vulnerable to other people influencing them or defining them as much. And then we looked at the opposite end, which are the tools that are useful in interpersonal relationships that will help them navigate their authentic selves. So that's the information for tonight. So, other questions in general?
I don't see any yet, but maybe we can give a couple minutes, do you think?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'll hop back on if I get a question.
Okay, good.
Okay, I have a question.
Okay.
It says, what about the last page of the handout with marshmallow and nurture?
Okay, so that's what we were talking about when I was saying that so marshmallowing is where you continue to do something even though you feel resentful or manipulated. That marshmallowing is your first signal I was talking about that you need to change your boundary. But sometimes we'll talk ourselves into it, but then we'll get so resentful we start criticizing. We go to the next level of having a poor boundary. So, for example, let me give you an example. So, let's say you've been lying down with your child since they were toddlers, and now they're 8, 9 years old, and you still have to lie down with them when they go to bed. And if you loved it and you just loved that time and you could lay there for an hour and a half and you were happy, you're still on that nurturing side. There's no resentful. Doesn't matter if Somebody else might be resentful. If you're not resentful, it's still an okay boundary for you to lie down with them. But if you are lying down with them and you are getting more and more sort of frustrated because you really would like to have like that last hour before bed to yourself, but you keep thinking to yourself, but they can't go to sleep without me, so I guess I'll just do it. Internally, you're building more and more resentment. You're marshmallowing. You should change your boundary right then. But many of us miss that first red flag and keep convincing ourselves we just are going to keep accommodating. And then we get so resentful that we end up one of those nights saying, I am sick and tired of lying down with you. You are way too old for me to have to do this. So we end up shaming or criticizing our child unnecessarily because we should have changed that boundary before we got so resentful that we criticized. So that's why marshmallow is your first signal, and you ideally would change your boundary as soon as you felt resentful. If you don't, that marshmallowing will lead to critical. And if you, and then, you can change, you can and should change your boundary if you get to criticize, but just know that ideally you don't want to get to be critical before you change that boundary. Okay. Did that answer?
Yep. I have another question.
Okay.
Can you please give some examples of how boundary problems reveal themselves through feeling resentful and criticizing?
Okay. So that was one. Hopefully that was one. Um, so let's say that you have been talking to, I'm just going to use a common one I hear. You've been talking to a partner about, I need more help with the house cleaning up. I need more help keeping the house up. And you've said it, and you've said it. They aren't doing anything. You just keep cleaning up the house, but you're getting more and more resentful. But then you'll end up one of those days or nights saying to your partner they're lazy, you're sick and tired of how they don't listen to you. You just go through this tirade, whereas way back when you were basically feeling resentful is when you would have figured out another strategy to getting the house clean. That might look like, we call bottom lines. It might look like, hey, listen, George, I've asked you so much to help me clean. I'm just getting more and more resentful. I don't think that's good for either of us. So I've called and have someone coming in to clean once a month. So you set a bottom line. You changed your boundary so you don't have to be angry anymore. So let's see. Another one would be that you have been cooking dinners and your kids are complaining about the food and that they don't, it tastes awful, and you just keep doing it, but you're getting more and more resentful about how much time and energy you're spending fixing food, and they are just complaining. And then at some point, probably several points, you end up saying, that that's rude, and they just, that is really hurtful, and they're unappreciative, and all the other criticisms you're going to have out of that resentment. Whereas you may get to that place where you're resentful and you say to yourself, okay, I'm not going to just do this anymore. Now I'm going to come up with some kind of strategy. So you might say, I am going to let you each pick out a menu a week and I'll grocery shop for that, that dinner for you. And then the other dinners, you have to eat what the other people have for their choice for dinner. You might say, if your kids were older, I am going to cook 2 times a week, and then I'm not cooking anymore. Or you might say, you're on your own to fix yourselves. I've got healthy food in the fridge, but you're on your own to fix yourselves your meal. Or you might say, I'm going to cook once I'm going to expect you to cook once a week, each of you. And so that I'm not resentful about cooking every night and having people complain. So you're basically going to figure out a way where you no longer feel resentful. That's changing your boundary. Okay. Anyone else?
I don't have anything else yet. Oh, wait a sec. This one's, it's, did you see this one pop up? The long one?
Let me see. Um, Whoops, it
I
just went
can
down.
read it.
Yeah, just read it to me. It just went off again.
Okay. So it's long, so bear with me.
Okay.
My son's biological father has not been around for 10 years and he's 11. I feel like a lot of his self identity lately has become about his biological dad and wanting to know more and what he got from him, looks, genes, etc. He was abusive and a drug addict. I work on answering questions factually and letting him know he is wanted and loved, and that if his bio father was safe, I would absolutely allow him to see him. Any tips or help with tools I can use to support his interest and self identification around his father without him being involved? I try to use terms like his choices are bad, not him as a person, etc. But I'm interested in any other help.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're doing a really intentional, conscious job of trying to really help because, as I talked about earlier, kids see themselves of half of each bio parent. And so he's at an age where he's really, and 11, I just said 11, 12, 13 is a very important age for kids to sort of define, to work on self definition. So it doesn't surprise me you're getting a lot of that. And so you're doing a great job in that he's wanting to know about that half of himself. And I think what's important is that you've been really clear that you're not pointing out that that half of him is all bad. In which, if you focused on his abuse and his drug addiction, it's like, okay, if that's who I am, half of me is not is kind of a despicable person. But if you can really help him recognize that aside from him being abusive and an addict, he was really creative. He had beautiful eyelashes that he has. He had um, a really, really fun sense of humor. It's like you sometimes the way I help people sort of go is that I will say, try to remember why it is that you fell in love with someone. It doesn't mean that you didn't fall out of love and all those other things didn't happen that are really painful and dysfunctional. But if you can kind of go back and remember, then you have the ability to point out some of those things. And it can be as simple. Sometimes I think we feel like it's got to be all these big things, like, but it can be simple. Like sometimes you could be making macaroni and cheese and you could say, without even your son asking, you could say, your dad loved macaroni and cheese. And kind of laugh. It's like, gosh, it must be some kind of, genetic predisposition for mac and cheese. And, it's like little simple things that give them a sense that they have something that other person who defines half of who they are has these little characteristics. And it sounds like you're doing a great job. It sounds like he's doing a great job by asking. But I do want to say it is helpful to just share. So if you see a characteristic or you remember something, it's like, don't wait for him to ask you, just share it so that it doesn't feel like it's somehow not okay to ask or to feel good about that. I would never lie to him, and you're doing a good job of that. So you're talking about his choices, not him as a person, his issues, not him as a person. You're doing a terrific job from that perspective. So, yahoo for you. All right. Anybody else?
No one else, but the person who just had that question said that is so helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. You're so welcome. Okay, anybody else about tonight or any of the information?
I don't see anything popping up.
Okay, then I guess we're good for tonight.
Okay.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Candice.
You're so
We
welcome.
appreciate you.
Good. Have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye.